6:40 in the morning, April 1945, Western Germany. The war in Europe was almost over. American tanks were moving through shattered villages, German units were collapsing, and General George S. Patton's Third Army was pushing deeper into enemy territory. But on one quiet farm road, a group of American soldiers stopped in front of something ordinary, an old wooden barn. The doors were shut. The lock was on the outside. There were no animals inside, no farmer nearby, no sign of normal life. Then one soldier stepped closer and heard something behind the wood, a weak voice, not German, English. In that moment, the barn was no longer just a farm building. It became a question: who was inside and why had someone locked them away? According to accounts of late war discoveries, American POWs were sometimes found in places no army map would ever mark: farm buildings, cellars, temporary holding sites, and abandoned structures across a collapsing Germany. The exact details of this specific barn story are difficult to verify, so a responsible documentary should not pretend every dramatic detail is official record. But the kind of horror this story represents was very real in 1945. As Allied troops moved across Germany, they found prisoners in shocking conditions. Some had been marched from camp to camp, some had been abandoned, some had been hidden, and some were alive only because rescue arrived before time ran out. But if this barn held American prisoners, the darker question was immediate. Was this panic neglect, or had someone deliberately hidden these men until they died? Before we continue, subscribe to the channel for more forgotten WWII stories told with respect, truth, and cinematic detail, because some of the most powerful moments in history were not found in famous battles. They were found behind closed doors. By April 1945, Germany was collapsing from every direction. From the west, American and British forces were crossing rivers, clearing towns, and pushing through defensive lines. From the east, the Soviet army was closing in with overwhelming force. Roads were crowded with refugees, retreating soldiers, abandoned vehicles, broken bridges, and military columns moving in confusion. The war was ending, but for prisoners still hidden inside Germany, the final days could be the most dangerous of all. That is what made one locked barn so frightening. Even as liberation came closer, some men were still disappearing from the world. Patton's Third Army was famous for speed, but speed in war was never only about courage. Armies moved because roads were cleared, bridges were repaired, fuel trucks kept coming, engineers solved problems, and supply lines survived the chaos. Every village had to be entered carefully. Every crossroads could be mined. Every farmhouse could hide soldiers, weapons, documents, or prisoners. So when the Americans approached that barn, they did not rush in blindly. They moved carefully, because in the final weeks of the war, silence could be dangerous. The building itself told the first part of the story. The doors were heavy and practical, built for farm work, not human imprisonment. But the lock was outside, and that detail mattered. It meant whoever was inside was not hiding from the war. They were being held. The soldiers checked the yard. They watched the windows. One of them called out. For a few seconds there was no answer. Then came the sound again, weak, dry, almost broken. A voice from inside. English, "We're Americans." No explosion could have changed the mood faster. The soldiers were no longer searching a building. They were racing against whatever had happened behind that door. The lock was forced open. Metal cracked, wood shifted, the barn doors began to move. After months of darkness, daylight entered the space. What the soldiers saw inside was not something any man could easily forget. American POWs were there, weakened by hunger, sickness, cold, and confinement. Some were sitting against the walls, some lay on the floor. Some tried to rise but could not. A few covered their eyes from the sudden light. Others stared at the soldiers as if rescue itself seemed impossible to believe. These were not enemy troops. They were Americans, men who had once worn the same uniform, marched under the same flag, and expected that if they were captured, the rules of war might still protect them. But by spring 1945, the rules were breaking down with the regime that had ignored them. For months, time inside a place like that would not be counted by dates. It would be counted by hunger, cold nights, footsteps outside the door, and the fear that rescue might never come. Some men may have repeated names from home just to stay alive: a wife, a mother, a town, a street. When the door finally opened, they were not just stepping into sunlight, they were stepping back into the world. But the soldiers outside could not stop with emotion. Saving starving men was not as simple as opening a door. After months of deprivation, even food could become dangerous. The first response was security and survival. Some soldiers searched the farmhouse and nearby buildings. Others checked the yard and rode for guards, weapons, documents, or signs of recent movement. In those final days, many German soldiers and officials fled before they could be questioned. Some destroyed evidence. Others blended into civilian crowds and claimed they knew nothing. At the same time, medics moved toward the prisoners. Blankets came first, then water, but carefully. Starved bodies could not safely handle too much too fast. The men needed controlled help, small amounts of liquid, warmth, medical checks, triage, and evacuation. Some prisoners may have asked what day it was. Others may have asked if Germany had surrendered. Some may have asked whether their families knew they were alive. And some may have said nothing, because after a long captivity, the mind needs time to believe what the eyes are seeing. Word began spreading through the American column. POWs had been found, hidden alive in a locked farm building. That message carried a different weight from a normal battlefield report. This was not a bridge captured or a road cleared. These were American soldiers, men who had survived behind enemy lines only to be found near the edge of collapse. And once a discovery like that reached command, it became more than a rescue. It became a question of responsibility. Who had the key? Who knew they were there? Who fed them? Who stopped feeding them? And who walked past that barn while men were dying inside? Patton was not known as a quiet commander. He was aggressive, emotional, demanding, and controversial. His soldiers knew him as a man who wanted movement, discipline, and victory. But Patton also understood the bond between soldiers. A report about weakened American POWs hidden in a locked barn would not have felt like a statistic. It would have felt personal. Whether Patton personally stood in that exact farmyard or learned of the discovery through his command chain, the meaning was the same. Speed was no longer only about winning ground. It was about reaching men before they vanished behind another locked door. Imagine the scene from the soldier's point of view: dust hanging in the air, medics working near the open barn, blankets being carried forward, canteens being passed carefully, officers speaking in low voices. The building behind them looked ordinary from the outside, and that was what made it disturbing. Nothing about it announced cruelty. It was just timber, hinges, boards, and a roof. But inside, men had been reduced to shadows. That was the horror of the final months of Nazi Germany. Some crimes were not hidden in massive fortresses. They were hidden in ordinary places, behind ordinary doors. We do not have a verified official quote proving the exact words Patton spoke about this specific barn scene, and it would be dishonest to invent one as fact. But the emotional truth of such a moment is easy to understand. Men who had spent months behind a locked door did not need a grand speech. They needed water, blankets, medical care, and one message above all: you are safe now. You are going home. For men who had lived with fear for so long, safety was not an idea. It was an American medic kneeling beside them. It was hearing English outside the door. It was realizing the lock had been broken and would not close again. But the barn still raised a darker question. If these men had been found only by chance, how many others were still waiting somewhere else? That question pushed the story beyond one farm. Across Germany in 1945, Allied soldiers were finding prisoners in conditions that shocked even men hardened by combat. Some were in known camps. Others were in smaller holding sites, labor locations, transport routes, and temporary prisons created as the Nazi system fell apart. Soldiers trained to fight suddenly became witnesses. They opened doors, cut fences, carried the weak, searched buildings, recorded names, and tried to understand how ordinary places had been used for suffering. The closer Allied forces came to victory, the more evidence they found of what had been hidden. The search of the farm mattered because the building itself was evidence. A lock on the outside told one story, blocked openings told another. The condition of the men told the clearest story of all. Civilians might claim fear. Guards might say they followed orders. Officials might disappear. But a structure can reveal what words try to hide. A barn is normally built to protect life, animals, grain, tools, harvest. In war, the same beams and boards can be twisted into confinement. And when soldiers searched that farm, the question became sharper. Was the silence around the barn accidental, or had the village learned not to see? For the rescued men, the next battle was survival. Liberation did not instantly heal starvation, infection, fear, or trauma. Medics had to decide who needed immediate evacuation, who could drink, who could eat, who could walk, and who had to be carried. Names had to be written down, units identified, families eventually notified. A man could be free and still not feel safe. He could be in American hands and still wake up expecting the door to close again. That is one of the hardest truths about captivity. A man can leave a prison before the prison leaves his mind. And as the POWs were moved away from the barn, one thought must have haunted the soldiers who found them. What if the Americans had arrived 1 week later? Patton's army could not stop for one tragedy, no matter how powerful it was. That was the brutal reality of the final campaign. There were still towns to secure, roads to clear, bridges to cross, enemy units to disarm, and prisoners to find. Every mile mattered. Every hour mattered. A locked door was no longer just a door. A quiet farmhouse was no longer just a farmhouse. Each place might hide evidence, prisoners, or crimes that would vanish if the army arrived too late. The war was ending, but for the men still trapped inside Germany, the end had not come yet. That is why stories like this hold attention even decades later. They are not just about Patton. They are not just about one barn. They are about the terrifying gap between military victory and human rescue. A battle can be won on a map, while men are still starving in a building nearby. A front line can move forward while prisoners behind it are still waiting. History often remembers the generals, the tanks, the flags, and the surrender dates. But the men inside that barn were living a different calendar. Their war did not end when a city fell. It ended when the door opened. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the guns in Europe began to fall silent. But silence did not mean forgetting. Men rescued from captivity carried their memories home. Some returned to families and tried to rebuild normal lives. Some spoke about what happened. Others stayed quiet for years. The world wanted victory stories, but not everyone knew how to listen to survival stories. That is why this kind of account matters, even when its exact details must be handled carefully. It reminds us that the final days of World War II were not only about armies advancing. They were also about hidden prisoners waiting, medics working, soldiers searching, and doors being opened before it was too late. So maybe the strongest image is not Patton's jeep, or the broken lock, or even the shocked soldiers outside. Maybe it is one weakened prisoner stepping into daylight, blinking at the sun, hearing American voices, and realizing that after months of darkness, he had not been forgotten. The barn had been locked, but hope had survived behind it. History is not only made in famous battles. Sometimes it is made in forgotten buildings, in the moment a door opens, and in the quiet breath of men who lived long enough to see the light again. And if this story reminded you that World War II still holds hidden human stories behind every battlefield, subscribe to the channel, leave your thoughts in the comments, and watch the next documentary to uncover another forgotten moment from the final days of the war.